The veiled woman was shown to the third chair from the left without anyone troubling to ask her name, because a woman in deep mourning black at an engagement dinner is a thing the whole of society has learned not to question, and Miranda Coldwell had counted on precisely that courtesy when she wrote, under a hand not her own, requesting a quiet place at the edge of her son's happiest evening. She had been dead, as far as Halworth was concerned, for 2 years and 3 months. The yacht had gone down off the Cornish coast in April, in weather that turned foul faster than the charts had promised, and of the 6 souls aboard only 2 bodies were ever recovered, and the Duchess of Halworth had not been among them. The county had held a memorial. Her son, Alastair, had worn black for a year and had commissioned a portrait for the Long Gallery with a black-draped frame, and Miranda Coldwell had spent every one of those 2 years and 3 months in a cottage on the Isle of Skye under her old nurse's maiden name, healing a shattered collarbone and a considerably more shattered certainty about who exactly had arranged for that yacht to founder. She had come home tonight, veiled and unannounced, because her solicitor's final piece of proof had arrived that very morning, and because her son was about to bind himself for life to a young woman handpicked, groomed, and financed by the one man in England who had every reason on earth to want Miranda Coldwell to stay drowned. Star. Lord Reginald Coldwell, the Duke's uncle and, for 2 years, the estate's de facto regent during his nephew's long minority in all but law grief, stood at the head of the drawing-room with a glass of his late brother's best claret and an expression of comfortable, well-fed satisfaction that Miranda watched from behind her veil with a stillness that cost her every ounce of the composure she had spent 2 years rebuilding. "A toast," Reginald said, "to Alastair and to his choice, Miss Georgiana Sutter, who I am confident will bring precisely the steadiness this house has wanted since its darkest hour." The room drank. Miranda did not lift her glass, and no one troubled to notice that she hadn't, because no one had troubled to notice her at all beyond the reflexive murmur of sympathy accorded any grieving stranger at the edge of a happy gathering. Alastair Coldwell, 10th Duke of Halworth, stood beside his intended with the particular brittle brightness of a young man performing happiness he had not entirely convinced himself he felt, and Miranda, watching her son from behind black gauze, felt her chest tighten with a grief that had nothing to do with the mother he believed dead and everything to do with the boy she could see, even now, working very hard to be glad. She had watched him grow into that particular brightness across the whole of the previous year, from a distance she had not been able to close, a letter smuggled to her Skye cottage now and again by her old nurse's grandson, who traveled to the mainland twice a month and had proven, over 2 years, entirely trustworthy with a secret that would have ended him his position and very possibly his liberty had Reginald ever learned of it. The letters had grown shorter and more careful as the months passed, Alastair's grief settling into something quieter and more permanent, and Miranda had read each one with her heart in her throat, aching to write back plainly, to tell him the whole truth and end his mourning in an afternoon, and had made herself, each time, fold the letter away unanswered, because she had understood, from the very first week in that cold cottage, that revealing herself too soon would hand Reginald every advantage he needed to finish what the yacht had failed to do. It had cost her more than the 2 years themselves. It had cost her the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of her son's grief, the year he could have spent healed instead of hollow, the birthday she had missed, the small daily griefs of a young man managing a father's estate without either parent at his shoulder to steady him. She had weighed that cost against Reginald's freedom to finish stealing the whole of Alastair's inheritance while a grieving nephew trusted him blindly, and she had chosen, every single week for 2 years, the harder arithmetic, because a mother who returned too soon and lost the proof entirely might spend the rest of her life watching her son manage an estate quietly bled dry by a man who would simply try again, more carefully, the second time. Star. Georgiana Sutter was 22, pretty in the particular polished way that considerable money spent carefully can produce, and she had clearly been coached, by her own ambitious mother, by Reginald's careful patronage, by 2 years of being told exactly which stories would serve her best in exactly which rooms, and the story she told that evening, to a circle of guests gathered near the fire, was one she had plainly told before and found reliably effective. Of course, the house was terribly gloomy when Alastair first began calling on me, Georgiana said, with the easy, practiced regret of a woman recounting an inconvenience now safely past. One heard the most extraordinary things about the late Duchess, cold, they said, and terribly controlling, forever managing every particular of the household down to the last candle, and poor Alastair grew up rather starved for warmth, I think, under all that management. I confess I have made it rather my mission since to bring some actual life back into Halworth. One cannot mourn a ghost forever, however dutiful the mourning. A ripple of polite laughter went round the circle. I understand she was not even particularly beautiful, Georgiana went on, warming to the audience. For all the portraits flatter her considerably. Mrs. Aldridge told me the artist was instructed most particularly to soften the jaw, which I think says a very great deal. It is rather a relief to the whole county, if I am honest, that Halworth might finally have a mistress people can be genuinely glad to see enter a room, rather than one they merely tolerated out of duty. Miranda Coldwell sat in the third chair from the left and listened to a stranger dismantle 2 decades of her own life in front of a room that had once called her friend, and did not move, and did not speak, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very clear. She had not come tonight to be flattered. She had buried a husband at 30, raised a son largely alone through a decade of Reginald's increasingly confident interference in the estate's management, and had learned, across 20 years as Duchess, precisely how little the ton's good opinion was actually worth compared to the steady, unglamorous work of keeping 4,000 acres and 1,100 tenants fed through 2 bad harvests and 1 bank panic. She had never particularly needed to be liked. She had needed to be trusted by the people who actually depended on her, and she had earned that trust the hard way year upon unglamorous year. She had not expected, sitting veiled in her own drawing room, to discover quite how thoroughly 2 years of careful, deliberate cruelty could unmake a reputation she'd spent a lifetime building, nor how casually the young woman about to become her son's wife could recite the unmaking, smiling, to a circle of guests who had once curtsied to her in this very room. It was Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper's own sister, and a woman who had known Miranda Coldwell since before her marriage, who noticed, at last, the particular stillness of the veiled woman in the third chair, and the particular set of her gloved hands, folded too precisely, in a manner that struck some old unexamined chord of memory. She crossed the room, hesitant, and crouched beside the chair. "Forgive me, madam. I do not believe we have been introduced, and I find myself curious. Are you quite well? You have not touched your wine, and you have been sitting so very still." Miranda considered, for one long moment, simply rising and leaving, walking out the same quiet way she had come in, veiled and unremarked, and finishing what remained of her investigation without ever having to stand in that room and be seen. She had planned, coming tonight, to observe only, to gather one final confirming glimpse of Reginald's comfortable satisfaction before she moved against him properly, through solicitors and magistrates rather than through the raw wreckage of a public scene. But she had just listened to a stranger tell a room that she had not even been particularly beautiful, that her own son had been starved for warmth under her management, that the whole county was relieved to be rid of her, and something in Miranda Coldwell, worn thin by 2 years of enforced silence, simply would not permit her to leave that sentence unanswered. She thought, in that last suspended second before her hand reached the gauze, of the cottage on Skye, of her old nurse's face the night Miranda had washed up half-drowned on the rocks below it, and the woman's absolute, unquestioning willingness to hide a Duchess under a dead sister's name for as long as the hiding was needed. She thought of the solicitor in Inverness who had travelled to London 11 times at his own considerable risk to trace Reginald's false accounts back to their true source, and of the sailor who had wept, finally, confessing what he had done to that rigging for £40 he had spent within the month and regretted every day since. 2 years of other people's quiet courage, spent on her behalf, so that this exact moment might arrive with the proof already in hand rather than merely her own word against a man who had spent 2 years perfecting his innocence. She reached up and drew back the veil. Mrs. Aldridge's teacup struck the floor and shattered, and the sound of it, small as it was, seemed to freeze the entire room in place. "Your Grace," Mrs. Aldridge said, in a voice gone entirely to a whisper, and then louder, unable to help herself, "Your Grace." The name went through that drawing room like a struck bell. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped halfway to lips, and Alastair Coldwell, 10th Duke of Halworth, turned from his conversation near the fire and looked across the room at a woman in mourning black with her veil thrown back, and went the color of old ash. "Mother?" "Yes," said Miranda Coldwell, rising from the third chair from the left with the particular unhurried dignity of a woman who has waited 2 years and 3 months for exactly this moment and did not intend to rush the finishing of it. "I am afraid so, my darling. very much alive, and very sorry indeed for the manner of this return, though I find, having just sat through the last quarter hour, that I am considerably less sorry for its timing. The room came apart entirely for several minutes. Guests rising, exclaiming, a dozen half-formed questions colliding in the air at once, and Alistair crossed the drawing-room in 6 long strides and took his mother's face in both hands as though he could not entirely trust the evidence of his own eyes. They found the wreck. They found 2 bodies. I wore black for a year, Mother. I commissioned your portrait for the gallery. I have grieved you every single day for 2 years. I know it, my darling, and I am going to explain every hour of those 2 years to you properly, in private, and you are going to be very angry with me before you are finished being glad, which I have entirely earned and will not argue against. Miranda held her son's face in return, memorizing it, 2 years older and thinner with grief than she remembered. But there is something that must be said in this room, tonight, before I go anywhere at all, because I have just sat in that chair and listened to your intended describe me to a circle of our neighbors as a cold, unlovely, unmourned ghost, and I find I have rather a great deal to say about that particular account before the evening goes one moment further. Georgiana Sutter stood frozen near the fire with her wine glass still in her hand, the color draining from her face with a speed that told the whole room, more plainly than any confession could have, exactly how thoroughly she understood what she had just done. Your Grace, I did not know. I could not have known you were in the room. I would never have said. You would never have said it in front of me, Miss Sutter. That is rather the entire distinction I find myself unable to forgive. Miranda's voice was not raised, but it carried to every corner of that silent drawing-room with a precision that made several guests take an involuntary step back. You did not simply repeat gossip you had heard secondhand. You constructed a portrait of a dead woman, unbeautiful and unbeloved and unmourned, specifically calculated to make yourself appear, by comparison, the warmer and more welcome mistress of this house. And you did it not once tonight, but I gather, from Mrs. Aldridge's face, on a great many evenings before this one, whenever it served your particular purpose to have Halworth believe its late Duchess deserved rather less grief than it had given her. I only meant. I know precisely what you meant, Miss Sutter, because I have spent 20 years in rooms exactly like this one, and I recognize the particular architecture of a woman clearing space for herself by diminishing the woman who came before. Miranda turned, slowly, to look at Reginald Coldwell, who had gone very still near the fireplace, his glass of claret entirely forgotten in his hand. What I find considerably more interesting, however, is who taught you the value of that particular architecture, Miss Sutter, because I do not believe for one moment that a young woman of 22 arrived at the strategy of erasing a dead Duchess's memory entirely on her own initiative. Reginald Coldwell set down his glass with a hand that was not quite steady. Miranda, this is, I confess I scarcely know what to say. We believed you drowned. The whole county mourned you. The whole county mourned a story, Reginald, and I have spent 2 years discovering exactly who wrote it. Miranda crossed the room toward him with the same unhurried, deliberate pace she had used crossing from her chair, and the whole gathering parted before her without anyone quite deciding to move. I did not simply survive that wreck by luck, whatever the county assumed. I survived it because I went into that water already suspicious of the man who had, 3 weeks before, quietly moved £11,000 of the estate's ready capital into an account I could not trace. And I have spent every month since confirming, through a solicitor you do not know exists and records you believe destroyed in a fire that was rather less accidental than the parish register records it, exactly how much of my son's inheritance you have spent the last 2 years converting into your own. The room had gone entirely, perfectly silent. You will forgive me, Reginald said, attempting a laugh that landed nowhere at all, if I find this rather a great deal of theater for one evening. Grief does strange things to a person's judgment, Miranda, and 2 years alone with your own imagination. I have the ledgers, Reginald. I have the false accounts you kept for Alistair's benefit and the true ones you kept for your own, and I have 3 witnesses prepared to swear before a magistrate exactly how the estate's tenant rents were quietly redirected through a shipping concern you control, and I have a rather detailed account, from a sailor who has since developed a considerable conscience and a considerable need of money, of exactly how much you paid to have that yacht's rigging compromised before it ever left harbor. Miranda's voice did not rise, and did not need to, because every word of it landed in that silent room like a struck nail. I did not stay drowned for 2 years out of grief, Reginald. I stayed drowned because a woman presumed dead can gather proof against her own murderer with a freedom no living Duchess would ever be permitted. And I find, standing here tonight, that the wait has proven entirely worth its cost. Star. Alastair Coldwell, standing very still beside his mother, looked at his uncle with an expression that shifted, over the course of several long seconds, from disbelief through horror into something considerably colder. You arranged the wreck. Alastair, your mother has clearly suffered some manner of episode. You arranged the wreck, the Duke said again, and his voice had gone entirely flat in a way that silenced whatever Reginald had been about to offer next. I have spent 2 years watching you manage this estate with what I believed was patient, grieving loyalty to my father's memory and mine, and I find I have been watching a man quietly finish stealing what he could not simply inherit outright. He turned to Georgiana, who stood white-faced and silent near the fire, her earlier confidence entirely collapsed. And I find I would very much like to know, Miss Sutter, precisely how much of our courtship was your uncle's design as well, given how conveniently your mother's own finances appear to have improved since my uncle began encouraging the match. Star. Georgiana Sutter did not attempt, at that point, to salvage anything at all. My mother owed money to Lord Reginald, she said low, all the earlier polish gone out of her voice entirely. A great deal of money from before my father died. He offered to forgive the whole of it if I secured your interest, your grace, and taught me, coached me over a full year, in exactly what to say and how to say it, and I did not ask too many questions about why he wanted your mother's memory diminished so particularly, because I did not want to know the answer badly enough to lose the forgiveness of my mother's debt. Her voice cracked. I am not proud of any of it. I did not know your mother was alive, and I did not know the whole of what my performance was actually serving. But I knew it was cruel, and I did it anyway, because I found it easier than being poor. Star. The room did not empty quickly. Guests who might, on any other evening, have made a swift and tactful exit from a family's private catastrophe found themselves instead rooted in place, unable to look away from a scene that would furnish every drawing room in the county for a decade, and Mrs. Aldridge, having recovered from her own shattered teacup, moved quietly among them with a tray of fresh glasses, murmuring apologies for the mess, as though pouring wine might somehow steady a room that had just watched a dead woman prove her own attempted murder. You will want witnesses to what has been said here tonight, Miranda told the room at large, her composure entirely restored now that the veil was down and the worst of the telling was behind her. I do not intend to rely solely on my own account when this reaches a magistrate, and I find a drawing room full of the county's better families makes rather excellent testimony, whatever the awkwardness of the circumstance. Lord Faring, Mrs. Aldridge, Sir Peter. I would ask each of you to remember precisely what you have heard tonight, because you will very likely be asked to repeat it under oath before the year is out. Lord Faring, an elderly baron who had known Miranda's late husband since Eton, cleared his throat and stepped forward with the particular gravity of a man glad to have something useful to do with his shock. You may count on my memory, your grace, and my testimony besides. I have known Reginald Coldwell 30 years and confess I never much cared for him, though I could not have told you why until this evening made the reason rather plain. Star. Reginald Coldwell did not wait for the magistrate to be sent for. He left Halworth that same night, before the local constable could be summoned, and was apprehended 11 days later at Dover attempting passage to the continent with what remained of the embezzled funds. And the trial that followed at the spring assizes was, by every account, the most thoroughly documented case of estate fraud the county had seen in a generation. Miranda Coldwell's 2 years of patient, methodical evidence-gathering, leaving her brother-in-law's solicitors almost nothing to argue. He was convicted of fraud and of conspiracy in the attempted destruction of the yacht, and transported, and Halworth did not speak his name again in any hall of that house for the remainder of Miranda's long life. Star. The trial itself, in March, was a considerably longer and more grinding business than the drawing-room's dramatic unraveling had suggested it might be, and Miranda spent 11 days in the Winchester Assize Court watching her brother-in-law's expensive counsel attempt every manner of delay and misdirection the law permitted him. She testified for the better part of a full day, walking the court through 2 years of evidence with the same unhurried precision she had brought to the drawing-room, the falsified ledgers, The shipping concern registered under a clerk's name that traced back, through 3 careful steps, to Reginald's own signature. The sailor's confession, given willingly once Miranda's solicitor had located him and offered him considerably more than £40 for the truth. The parish registers. Suspicious fire, which a second, undamaged copy in the bishop's own archive proved, had never needed setting at all, since the true records had simply been moved rather than destroyed. Reginald's counsel attempted, on the 9th day, to suggest that a woman 2 years drowned and presumed dead might reasonably be assumed to have suffered some disturbance of mind sufficient to color her testimony, and Miranda answered that suggestion herself, from the witness box, in a voice that silenced the whole courtroom rather more effectively than her solicitor's objection managed to. "I have spent 2 years compiling a case precise enough to survive exactly this argument, sir, because I anticipated it would be made. A disturbed mind does not generally produce 3 independent witnesses, 2 sets of matching ledgers, and a shipwright's own sworn account of the modifications he was paid to make. If my mind is disturbed, I would ask the court to consider that it has nonetheless proven considerably more thorough than my brother-in-law's attempt to cover his tracks." The jury took 40 minutes to return a verdict. Georgiana Sutter's engagement to the Duke of Halworth ended that same evening, plainly and without cruelty on either side, because Alastair found he could not, in good conscience, blame a frightened young woman entirely for a scheme his own uncle had built and financed, though he could not either imagine building a marriage on the foundation her performance that evening had revealed. "I am not going to pretend what you said did not wound my mother, or that I can simply set it aside because you were coerced into the saying of it," he told her, the following morning, in a conversation considerably gentler than the county expected of him. "But I do not think you are a cruel woman at your core, Miss Sutter, only a frightened one who was taught cruelty by a man considerably more practiced at it than you will ever be. I hope you find a life beyond my uncle's debts and my uncle's designs. I do not think it can be built here." Georgiana Sutter left the county within the month, and settled eventually in Bath, where she made, by all later accounts, a considerably more honest life for herself than the one Reginald Coldwell had scripted, though she never again, so far as Halworth ever heard, spoke of the widowed Duchess at all in any company in any tone. Miranda wrote to her once, in the autumn unprompted, a single short letter that surprised Georgiana considerably more than any continued anger would have. "I do not forgive easily, and I will not pretend the wound of that evening has fully closed," the letter read. "But I have thought a great deal since about the particular cruelty of a world that teaches a frightened young woman with debts she did not incur that erasing another woman is the surest path to safety, and I find I am not able to hate you nearly so thoroughly as I once believed I would. I hope Bath is treating you kindly. I hope, more than that you never again find yourself in a position where someone else's ruin looks like your only door." Georgiana kept the letter for the rest of her life, and told her own daughter years later that it was the single most unexpected mercy she had ever been shown, and that she had tried, ever since, to be the kind of woman who might have earned it honestly the first time. Miranda Coldwell spent the following spring simply being, once more entirely and unmistakably alive, walking her own gardens, sitting at her own table, presiding over her own household with the same unglamorous competence she had brought to it for 20 years before a yacht's compromised rigging had tried and failed to end it early. "I did not think, coming home that night," she told her son, one warm evening on the terrace, "that I would have to fight for my own memory before I ever got to fight for my own life. I had prepared for Reginald. I had not prepared for a stranger telling a room I had not even been particularly beautiful. You were entirely beautiful, Mother. You are entirely beautiful now." Alastair took her hand. "I have thought a great deal this spring about how easily I let 2 years of grief be shaped by a story I never troubled to question closely enough. I mourned a woman my uncle had quietly redrawn into someone smaller and colder than you ever were. And I did not notice the redrawing because grief does not generally invite a person to check the portrait against the original. That is precisely why I kept quiet as long as I did, my darling. I did not want to be believed on my word alone, against a man who had 2 years' head start on the story. I wanted the proof to speak first, so that no one in that room could say afterward that a grieving widow's imagination had simply run away with her." Miranda squeezed his hand. "I am glad, all the same, that it was Georgiana's cruelty rather than my own proof that finally moved me to draw back that veil. I had planned to wait. I found, in the end, I could not sit in a chair and listen to a stranger call me a ghost one moment longer. I keep returning to the 2 years themselves, Mother. Not the proof, not Reginald, simply the ordinary time we lost. Every Sunday I did not have you across the table. Every letter I wrote to a grave that was not, in fact, occupied. Alistair's voice had gone rough. I do not know how a person properly grieves that loss, when the thing that caused it turned out to be worth preventing something so much worse. You grieve it exactly as slowly and as honestly as it deserves, my darling, and you do not let anyone, including your own mother, rush you past it simply because the ending turned out well. Miranda pressed his hand between both of hers. I lost those 2 years as surely as you did. I do not intend to pretend otherwise simply because I was the one who chose the losing of them. We shall grieve it together in whatever time it actually takes, and I find I am no longer in any hurry to have it done properly by a fixed date. The way the county was so eager to have my mourning finished on a schedule 2 years ago. Star. The portrait in the long gallery, the one commissioned in grief with its black-draped frame and its softened jaw, was taken down that summer and replaced with a new one, painted from life, in which Miranda Coldwell instructed the artist, quite firmly, to soften nothing at all. I have earned every line in this face, she told him, sitting for the portrait in the same drawing room where she had once sat veiled in the third chair from the left. I should like the whole county to see exactly what surviving 2 years of proving a murder actually costs a woman, rather than a flattering guess at what grief is supposed to look like on someone conveniently dead. The portrait hangs there still, unsoftened, in the same gallery where a black-draped frame once told a false story to anyone who troubled to look, and beneath it, on a small plate she insisted upon herself, it reads only, Miranda Coldwell, Dowager Duchess of Halworth, declared dead in 1817, considerably more alive than the county gave her credit for.